Well, I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the IMCL, Ettore, Suzanne, Leonard. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and speak about a topic that I guess I'll start by explaining to you that designing for refugee villages has been a little bit like chasing a constantly moving target, because the politics is shifting, as many of you know, simply by watching the news on a daily basis. The European Union has struggled to create policy and to adapt to the situation. So what you will see is a proposal or is an outline of some of the thinking that went into this project at a stage when many refugees were coming into Greece or reaching the shores of other European countries like Italy and Spain. That has changed a little bit because now refugees, there's an agreement between the European Union and Turkey to retain refugees who might arrive in Greece, for example, are sent back. But the principles that I will describe and the actual master planning that I will show you is designed to be adapted to any number of countries, any number of cultural and geographic contexts. So what I will begin by doing is reminding you. I mean, these images, I'm gonna walk you through some very familiar images, I'm sure. They're tragic images. They're a reminder that for all these wonderful things that we are discussing here today and in the next few days, we are in the middle of one of the greatest crises in Europe since World War II. And the tragedy, of course, primarily involves Syria and Syrian refugees who are both urban populations and also farming villages, populations and such. A huge migration that can really only be described as of biblical proportions. So the big question that arose when I began to think about this was what is Europe doing, what are architects doing to provide humane housing and to bring in these people, at least even temporarily, in a way that actually is civilized. A brief footnote about what got me interested in producing or putting together some thoughts about this is my brother, I being a Greek citizen, my brother Andreas has a home in one of the smaller Greek islands. Last summer was sitting in the Platia, or the main square, and was surprised to see a group of 12 men approach him looking rather bedraggled. All of them perfectly polite and rather educated. There was a lawyer, a doctor, an architect, an engineer, and they very politely asked if they could be directed to the local police station. And they were all Syrians, and they had just made a crossing and had ended up on that particular island. And it was a sort of a shock, a sort of a wake-up call, because it was a reminder that these people are very much like us here in this very room. And I have a bit of history in my family of migration and refugee status that goes back to my grandfather, but we probably all do. And if you reflect upon this, it is something that really does beg, it raises many questions that it is incumbent upon us, especially those of us who share the ideals of the IMCL of healthy cities and integrating populations. It's incumbent on us to actually deal with it. I will sort of chronicle the kind of the typical journey of the refugee briefly before I explain the thinking behind this proposal that I put forward with the additional input of my group of graduate students who I'm fortunate to be joined by here in the auditorium. As many of you know, the refugees, their first thought is to get out of the way of harm and to leave Syria or Iraq or wherever they may be sort of in the crossfires. And so what they usually do is they go into neighboring countries like Jordan or Turkey, etc. And what you're looking at is a picture of a refugee camp. One of the largest ones happens to be in Jordan. And I think the picture speaks for itself. The buildings are clustered in ways that do not encourage interaction. There are no public spaces to speak of. There is no structure. And of course, the buildings are flimsy. They are essentially shacks, to put it, well, mildly. Some of them nothing more than yurts or tents. And this is their first experience. And these people are not single adults. Very often they include entire families, elderly and children. And this is their first experience. And so they bring with them dreams of bettering their lives. And of course, many of them who seek asylum in the European Union are hoping to get out of this kind of a situation. The typical journey of the refugee while the Greek crisis was unfolding, the situation before the arrangement with Turkey was drafted, was that these migrants, these refugees, before seeking asylum, wanted to get as fast as possible to the European Union. And of course, the closest country, if you've gone into Jordan or Turkey, in the European Union is Greece. And so many would cross over from the Turkish coast to the closest Greek islands. And the most common routes were the islands of Lesbos and other islands like Kos and a few others. And as the diagram shows, the next thing is they would continue on through the mainland of Greece after being transported, making their way to Athens, or the port of Athens, and make their way up to the borders of some of the Balkan states, and then continuing on north, hoping to get to countries where jobs are more readily available. A lot of you are aware that Greece is experiencing its greatest economic crisis. It's often likened to the Great American Depression. So refugees are keen to continue on where jobs can be found. So scenes like the ones I'm showing you, tragic scenes. If you look closely, you'll see children, you'll see women and elderly and young men, many of whom have never been on any body of water in their lives, given fake lifesavers in inflatable boats that begin to deflate the minute they set into them, making it to the Greek coast. If they do, many have perished. And so the scenes of arrival in Greece at the time of the inception of this proposal were really rather emotional, rather moving. Some people just happy to have made it alive. And so their experience, having left camps like the ones I've shown you in Syria and Jordan and Turkey, is now this, or has been. And I'm showing you on the left, I'm showing you examples of the kind of places that they are directed to in Greece, but you will find very similar constructions in Italy and in Spain. They are directed to registration centers. These are not camps. They're not invited to stay there. They usually sleep in the woods, in the fields, anywhere they find. What they do here is they go and they register so that they can continue moving. They apply for visas that allow them to continue moving through, in this particular case, Greece. The images on the left are registration centers on, I think it's the island of Lesbos. And that's what I would call stage one housing, or it's essentially very temporal. and refugees often are very keen to move on. On the right, you have examples of housing of the sort that a refugee will find at a destination country. The two pictures are from Germany. And again, the housing here is temporary. There is no thought for any kind of urban plan or experience. Children, elderly, all these people, their experience continues to be rather abysmal. There are no facilities that encourage or facilitate social interaction. They either are housed in disused or refurbished older or abandoned buildings, or they're put in shipping containers, which have been adapted to look like or to resemble habitations. The reason Western European governments have been building such impermanent kinds of constructions is partly because of the fear of ghettoization. There's experience in Europe of exactly that kind of a situation with the banlieue in Paris and ghettos in many other cities in Europe where migrants end up congregating. And so the thinking is that the sooner they can get these migrants, these asylum seekers mixed into the neighborhoods, the better. And there's some logic in that. But that doesn't mean that the experience, which may last as up to 2 years in places like these, should be of poor quality. The examples I'm showing you here, these kinds of structures, are usually designed, from what I've surmised from the literature that one finds online, to last approximately 2 years, because the typical registration process may last up to 2 years. Let's go back now, because the proposal that I'm showing you here, what I'll get to shortly, really concerns what I call stage one housing, the experience the way to kind of welcome people when they arrive for the first time in the European Union. And the pictures here are again from Greece, what refugees have been experiencing. The diagram on the left, an EU diagram, shows that from the upper left-hand, upon arrival at a registration center, refugees are then screened and then directed to apply, either make their way on to a country, a destination, a target country, and then they proceed and apply for asylum, and they may get it or they may not. So in Greece, typically a refugee must join one of three lines. So, or that was more or less the norm until very recently. And one line was for Arabic speakers, which was primarily Syrians, Iraqis. Another line was for Afghans and Farsi speakers, people speaking a Farsi-related language, and there were translators and so on in place. And then, of course, the third line was for folks who were encouraged to apply for longer visas. And the option has been for 30-day visas or 180-day visas. The vast majority sought the 30-day visa because their intention was to continue on to Northern European countries. The 180-day visa was intended for asylum seekers who were willing to apply for asylum in Greece, and then were promised that they would then be made part of an exchange program where they would be sent to other countries of their choice. But provisions were made only for 160,000 of these people, which was rather a small number, which contributed also to the kind of reticence on the part of refugees to go that way. So most chose the 30-day visa, made their way up through the Balkan countries until these countries shut their borders recently, And on arriving in countries like Germany, they were assigned a worker, a social worker, who helped guide them through the application process, application for asylum, which usually lasted up to 6 to 9 months. But let's go back now and take a look at the registration centers that is often the first experience of the refugee. And I'm showing you examples in Greece, but you will find, as I said, examples, very similar examples in Italy and Spain and elsewhere. You find this sort of thing in Jordan and Turkey as well. This is actually a more polished example of the kind of registration, or a kind of governmental facility at a point of arrival. What you see here are Greek police officers, working with the crowds. You have these very temporary, industrially produced shelters which serve as government offices, and of course the camps themselves where refugees who are refused are kept are very much they're military barracks in every sense of the word. So some of the housing provisions that have been made have tended to rely on commercially available housing units like the examples here, which are all produced by IKEA. And the example below is in Jordan, vast amounts of units. The IKEA flat pack unit is actually rather clever. It includes devices, or solar panels, and all sorts of solar roof cooling devices and so on. But if you actually take a closer look at these units, you will find that they're hugely deleterious to the environment. First of all, take a look at the numbers, at the sheer numbers of these kinds of constructions. The example in Jordan below, but in Greece and Italy and elsewhere, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these kinds of units. They're made largely of PVCs, of vinyls. And vinyls, of course, are highly toxic and they're not biodegradable. Some biodegradable examples are made, but they're very costly, and so typically what you are looking at, the examples that I have shown you, are really designed to be discarded, and they end up in dumps. 2 years, most of these units are designed to last approximately 2 years. And they're also unsafe. Some governments, the Swiss government, for instance, has rejected the flat pack because of fire risks. This sort of a unit might be the home of a refugee family for even up to 2 years. Another thing that these units don't permit is repurposability. Now, repurposability is a very important aspect, I think, of good urbanism. And I would encourage the IMCL to perhaps consider adding it to their list of their wonderful list of what makes good urbanism. Because, and I'm showing you examples here of buildings that are built to endure and can then serve other purposes. We have some of the oldest examples in this city here, like the Temple of Deified Hadrian, which is now part of the Roman Stock Exchange building in the upper left corner. You have apartments built into the Theater of Marcellus in the lower left corner. In Britain, of course, mews houses, which used to be carriage houses, have been transformed to homes. And other examples that I'm showing here, the example in the lower right is an old brewery in Indiana, which now serves other purposes, commercial purposes. So repurposability is vital. Another very important point, or something we must always bear in mind, is that many of these populations, these refugees, these asylum seekers, come from highly urbanized parts of the world. In Syria, Syrians are a very urban group of people. They live in cities and towns traditionally, which have very familiar components, streets and squares and blocks, all these things that we celebrate here. And so that experience for them is something that I think is very important to maintain, especially for the sake of the children. So what I'm putting on the screen here is the starting point, the kind of the statement that kind of guided the design, the proposed template for these stage 1 welcoming centers. That we should build modest homes that should serve as temporary shelters for the dispossessed in those towns of their arrival. That we must do so responsibly, using natural materials which have no carbon footprint, and in such a way that buildings can easily be torn down when they cease to be useful without impacting the environment. Or else, they should be able to stand for generations. Let us arrange the houses to form real communities of hope, villages that dignify the waves of tired men, women, children while they wait for their asylum requests to be processed. And that when the crisis abates and the refugees have moved on to new places and new lives, these towns may serve the hosting nations by being converted into affordable neighborhoods or academical villages or resorts, etc. So what I'm showing you here is the master plan as it was developed. It is, you're to think of it not as a master plan for any one particular place. It's really meant to be understood as a template. And it is a template that includes, that is designed to be walkable, that is designed to be of a certain familiar human scale, that includes public spaces, streets, blocks, and a mix of functions. I'll show you the master plan. What you see here is, of course, the plan of what I was showing you previously, where you can see that there are really 4 urban quarters arranged around a pinwheel-shaped central plaza where public amenities, essential amenities for arriving refugees are clustered. So you have refectories, you have, I wish I had a pointer, which I don't, but at any rate, there's a government building, there is a services building, a transportation building, theaters, assembly halls, community halls clustered or located closer to the centers of each of the 4 quarters that this master plan incorporates. There's a mosque. There could be more. There's a church. Many of the refugees actually are Christian. All those sorts of things worked in and dispersed into the neighborhoods as much as possible. This diagram illustrates that a little bit more clearly, and you can see that on the outskirts of these clusters, these small communities, you might incorporate additional buildings. So some of you may ask, why a grid? We heard from Ferdinand Johns earlier, who showed us examples of gridded developments, antique or ancient Greek and Roman examples. And the reason, in fact, this master plan, this template, takes its inspiration from the Roman castrum primarily, with its cardo decumanus system, is because the castrum was designed for maximum ease of movement. It had a military purpose, and so movement of large numbers of people and policing was very important, as it is in some of these centers. Another advantage of the castrum example is that, or one of the aspects that was very sort of appealing, was that often these camps evolved into full-fledged towns, like the example I'm showing you on the screen here, which is the city of Padua. Other cities like Florence were very much the product of, they emerged, they developed in a very similar way out of Roman castra. There is a long history of migration, refugees in Greece. Many Greeks living in Greece today, including some of my ancestors, came to Greece from parts of the world where there were large concentrations of Greeks, and these migrations happened especially in the 1920s after the Greco-Turkish War and after World War II. And the images I'm showing you here are of refugee houses of the sort that were built after these migrations. And they were built with mud bricks. And what I love is the image on the upper right, these Greek children holding up bricks that they made. It's a very easy, very affordable, and highly ecological material. And that is very much what we've done with this master plan. Mud brick construction, or adobe, is still very popular. It's very practical. It's essentially a zero impact type of construction as far as the environment goes. It can be made with mud. The mud needs to be rich in clay, but you need some sand, some water, and some binding material. You could use hay, and there you have it. You put the mud in molds, and then you create these bricks. The example on the left in Gaza, a security building, and you don't even need much wood. You can simply reuse centering again and again. Examples on the right are from New Mexico. And you can actually construct a building. The bricks need to dry. They need about a week to dry. You need about a week to build a small home, and there you have it. Within 2 or 3 weeks, you have ready houses. And of course, adobe traditions are found all over the world, whether you're looking at Yemen, the Middle East, in the example on the upper left, or China on the upper right, the New World, New Mexico, of course, the adobe houses of the Pueblos, and Africa on the right. So it's familiar and it's alive. It's a system that's actually quite vibrant. A system that we looked at more closely is that of the Gorfa type houses from North Africa, in Tunisia here, where you get repetitive units with simple domes that can be built without centering, very much as Brunelleschi built his dome in Florence. And here's how it's done. It's the so-called Nubian system of construction. You simply lay the bricks in vaults by leaning them against each other, and the force of gravity allows you to build successive arches and complete vaults within a day without any centering. So that was part of the inspiration for this master plan. And I'm showing you here a typical unit that we looked at. You can see it's a unit that uses this Nubian system of vaulting. Why? Because to reduce the reliance on wood. Another advantage of mud brick is that if these buildings cease to be useful, the bricks can be broken up and worked right back into the topsoil, and it actually increases the productivity of the soil. In wetter climates, all you need to do is make sure that the exterior coating is impermeable, an impermeable layer of say lime plaster, and there you have it. And you might use some fired bricks to cover the vaults. So minimizing the amount of wood, minimizing the amount of centering, and so on. And these units were designed to hold up to 10 individuals in bunk bed arrangements. And the reason for that, the reason these units are as small as they are, is on the one hand to discourage squatting, refugees refusing to move on, because these centers are really intended to kind of take waves of people and encourage them to move on into their countries of destination, but also because that's approximately the size of a small hotel unit if some of these towns were to be converted into, say, holiday communities. Some drawings, the elevations here of these units. There could be some variation in the details. There's a small fireplace in each one because many of the refugees are, familiar, or they would be comfortable cooking their meals in a fireplace. And then the section cuts show you the interiors and how the construction might work. So this is where we left things with the master planning, at which point my group of 8 graduate students, who are all present, came into the picture. Here's the team. You can look around you. You might have one of them sitting next to you. But it's a wonderful team of incoming first-year graduates who undertook to design individual public buildings. And here's the master plan again, and you can see how the students then, how we distributed the work, each student working up one of these public buildings. The residential units having already been designed for maximum ecological performance. The public buildings, we thought we could be a little bit more flexible. It would be good to use natural materials, but we didn't feel it was absolutely necessary to rely on mud brick. It could very well be the case, but stone and other materials could very well be used. So we had bus station, government building, church, refectory, theater, mosques, services building, community hall, etc. And these are the section cuts, and these drawings here, which were finished very recently, show cuts through the urban template, the master plan, where the public buildings have been designed. Now, admittedly, these buildings represent the character that they communicate is that you might find on a Greek island. We took the island of Chios as an example where they studied public buildings, some of them more Byzantine, other a bit more neoclassical, and they designed these buildings on that, with that in mind. But it may well have been a Turkish site, it may well have been a Jordanian site, in which case the public buildings, the precedents for these buildings would have been somewhat different. More section cuts through the site. So I think, and leaving it to individual designers, I think another advantage is it kind of helped to create this richness, this variety of architectural expression and form, which happens in real towns. And each student, of course, was addressing a public space or a park or a street, and was integrated into an urban block, which consists of residential units primarily. Here's an aerial view again of that of the master plan, the template. A close-up, you can see the various public buildings. The large tower, by the way, is not a sacred structure. It is the water tower that would, of course, symbolically represent the heart of town, water being absolutely essential to these kinds of communities. Another thing we did is we imagined adapting the grid to a real site. What would happen if you had a site like the one on the left? This is a site adapted from a real topography on the island of Chios, where there's a combination of olive trees and mastic trees like they grow on Chios in a rather rugged, rocky terrain with a lot of brush and some pine trees. Here's how you might imagine this adaptation. You would essentially configure the important streets and to conform to the topography or the dominant grid of the land ownership, and then locate public buildings opportunistically as a traditional town plan would do. Yes. And just some very quick, I'll conclude with some images of of a project that the students worked up, the Port Authority complex on the lower right there, which here is a project, the Critics' Choice by student John Parker Wilmoth, who produced this complex, and where there's a centralized court and a variety of public spaces fronting the bay, and another project, the runner-up by Colton Saberson, who produced another internalized court project. But the reason I'm showing you these projects is because I want you to appreciate that, the importance of designing according to local precedent and architectural character. And with that, I'll conclude and thank you very much for your attention.